Starting in the 1930s, composer Scott Bradley created some of the most iconic cartoon scores of all time. Though the music could be quite complex, his vision was straightforward: to use the chaotic nature of serialist music to convey the chaotic nature of cartoons like Tom and Jerry. The rhythm, dynamics, and harmony of Bradley's pieces followed the movement of characters and punctuated the intensity of the action. They were not necessarily interested in conforming to the usual concerns of music. Many cartoons to this day create soundtracks that sync up to the action, though almost none are as daring as Bradley's, and many more aren't very musical at all, at least not on a scene-by-scene basis, being more incidental. However, contemporary cartoons also tend to be much less zany, I guess, and Bluey, the 2020 Australian show created by Joe Brumm about a family of healer dogs, is no exception. After all, Bluey is a show meant to be appealing to very young children, and so the music of Bluey reflects this and is rarely unpleasant. The soundtrack doesn't surprise you with large leaps or loud sounds, dissonance, or even a protracted focus on non-tertian chords or anything like that. The score does often modulate and change in rhythm to suit the action, but it also tends to stay in major, and if it goes anywhere, it's rarely too far. This makes sense, as in the 21st century, children do not tend to do well with very challenging, dissonant, atonal, or otherwise unfamiliar music. Instead, the music of Bluey focuses on a contemporary concept of universality.
Why do they do it? 'Cause they're nuts!
Mostly, it does this through the creation of kid-friendly arrangements, adapted from famous classical pieces, as well as occasionally just from popular music. These pieces tend to focus on simple and catchy, repeated melodic and rhythmic subjects that develop along with what happens in the episode. Many other shows have good soundtracks, but over the course of a long series, an over-reliance on series-wide musical motifs that play in every episode and that are incorporated into every scene can start to get stale. In Bluey, each episode is instead a separate exploration. In this sense, the content of the music harmonizes with the content of the show, as each episode of Bluey is itself a 7-minute long exploration. In the show, Bluey, Bingo, Chili, and Bandit are regularly involved in various kinds of highly imaginative and dynamic forms of play, with the show putting a special focus on teaching them, or at times only the audience, some kind of lesson or moral. This video is about how the music of the show builds off of these concepts, and how it even elevates them. In an ABC interview with Geoff Bush, the lead composer for the show's music, he talks about a few of the classical pieces used in the show. In just mentioning these, we have the likes of Mozart, Bach, Beethoven, Grieg, Tchaikovsky, and Holst. The last one is the episode I want to talk about first. This episode is called Sleepytime, and it currently has a 9.8 out of 10 on IMDb. This episode incorporates Gustav Holst's symphony, The Planets, and in the episode, the theme from the Jupiter movement is used as a metaphor for Bingo's parents. It returns at different points throughout the episode, and it uses these pleasant, swirling 80s-style synths to punctuate moments of closeness between the parents and the kids. The context for the episode is simple. Bingo is growing up. She's only a small child around 4 years old, and she wants to sleep by herself in her own bed for a change. Her mom reads her a story about planets and tells her it's okay if she doesn't go through with her promise. And that's it. That's the setup. The only other really important thing here is a detail. When Bingo asks Chili to pick up her stuffed bunny named Fluffy and give it to her, Chili noticeably picks it up like a toddler, supporting its head and neck. What follows is a really beautiful dream sequence that includes multiple layers of things happening that are all worth talking about. The dream sequence, as well as the first part of Jupiter, starts with Bingo and Fluffy breaking out of an Earth and Moon egg, respectively. It's a bit hesitant, and the rich-sounding pads add to the dreamlike quality and allow us to hear more of the harmonics. Which is good, as obviously there are a lower number of voices here than in an entire symphony. And The Planets uses a pretty huge symphony, I might add. The original starts out in 2/4 with a line of 8/16 notes per bar. These are played sharply, loudly, and with distinct gaps called staccato. When the horns, the violin, and the violoncello parts kick in, they say they're very heavy. Bluey's version, on the other hand, is not heavy. In fact, the beginning part in particular is quite understated. And if you count the bits before the dream starts, the episode really takes its time getting into Jupiter. It's slower, more spaced out, and not nearly as big and loud. This dreamlike version of the main theme continues until we see a sudden cut to Bluey standing there holding a glass. I saw a lot of people read this transition as funny, but I think there's an argument that it's also tension building. A lot of times, the sudden absence of a sound can be more jarring than a very loud one. Bluey wakes up Chili for a glass of water, but falls asleep on Chili's bed before Chili can even get back with it, so naturally, Mom scrunches up on the one available bed. But as Chili lies down, we see a floating/sleepwalking Bingo get up and go to the room with Bandit and Bluey. Here, I feel I should mention something. Each movement in the planets has a subtitle, and Jupiter's is the bringer of jollity. In Roman mythology, Jupiter was the king of gods, who oversaw all aspects of life, making him much like the Greek god Zeus, of course. It's easy to see in his kingly, auspicious nature how Jupiter here could be a metaphor for an actual father. Bingo even walks on the surface of Jupiter in her dream, as we hear the 3/4 segment that plays after the main theme. The original score is played pizzicato, that is to say by plucking the strings of the string instruments, and non-legato, as in with perceptible gaps for the wind instruments. It's a very lively and bouncy segment that then reveals Bingo and even Bluey joining in to slam their feet into their dad's chest in real life. Bingo then jumps into a hole on Jupiter, and it's implied that Bandit gets hit in the testes, at which point it cuts to Bingo and Fluffy hugging like a core of some kind. Yeah, like I said, it's kind of a lot, and most episodes are not as conceptual or as galactical. Personally, I see this as the most subtle and vague symbol of the episode, and I feel pinning it down might be missing the point. It's a dream after all, and Bingo is dreaming the things she is because they're comforting or useful to her in some way. Maybe that's not necessarily how dreams work in reality, but in media, a dream is rarely meaningless. In Michael Short's book, titled Holst, The Man and His Music, he incorporates Holst's remarks on the gestation of the Planet Symphony, which he wrote over the course of 3 years. That work, he said, whether it's good or bad, grew in my mind slowly, like a baby in a mother's womb. After Dad gets woken up, it seems everyone does, and they all start a tired shuffle around the house that ends in Bandit on the floor and with Bluey and Bingo being the only two left in the big bed. After Bluey has an unconscious tussle with her down but not out dad, the covers over Bingo get pulled off, and in the cold, she feels herself slipping into a dream with a less than comforting tone to it. Fluffy and Bingo sit in the darkness on a lonely moon, clearly cold and afraid, until they see the light of the sun shine through. They both make their way to Saturn, where Saturn's rings are made of other Fluffies, and the two share a solemn look that communicates how, though they both know this is hard for them, it's what must happen, and so the two depart. We even hear the sweeping offset portmanteaus in the score as a cute synth that syncs up to the spinning of the Fluffy rings. In this time, in real life, Bingo gets up and sleepwalks back to her and Bluey's room, dropping Fluffy in the process. Particularly of note, Saturn is the next movement of the planets after Jupiter, and while we don't actually hear the Saturn movement here, for a good reason I'm about to get into, we do hear the very end of Jupiter. In the planets, the Saturn section subtitle is the bringer of old age. Saturn, as the Romans saw him, was a god of time, one of dissolution, of accumulation, but also one of inevitable renewal. The actual Saturn movement, though, especially when compared to Jupiter, is quite intensely dark. It opens on these strange, repetitive, offbeat legatos. And I have to say, it's the sound of pure panic in my head. Smith suggests the labored breathing motion of the music may have come from Holst's struggles with asthma as a kid. And honestly, having had asthma as a kid myself, the feeling of these breaths is really overwhelming to me. It really takes over my mind. It's a piece that feels like an anxiety attack, in that it encourages me to interrupt my breathing, to become hyper-aware of it. I would perfectly understand why they avoided playing any part of Saturn in a kids' show for that reason alone, but there's also a different, perhaps more interesting reason for why Bingo never makes it into Saturn. As we said before bed, Bingo and Chili have a conversation about Bingo staying in her room all night. Bingo is faced with the scary reality of growing up and becoming independent. But she's also still really young, still in the age where she needs and adores her mom. Obviously, in this episode, the parents are compared to a planet or a sun, but in other episodes, Bandit and Chili are framed in a similarly massive way, being mountains or even gods, like in the evolution episode.
Little tackers. We made them.
Whether or not we read either of the parents in Sleepytime as gods, what's important here is Bingo's perspective. Like most kids, Bingo wants to grow, wants to mature, but her bark is bigger than her bite. She's scared she can't handle the emptiness of losing Fluffy, losing her own daughter. It's a metaphor for her fears of losing her mother, losing the part of the world that will protect her. As with most kids, Bingo's view of her mother is normal, but it's also flawed. Flawed because, in reality, Chili will not be there for her forever, but she can be there in her own ways. Bingo tears up as she waves goodbye to Fluffy, and since she's in the room with Chili now, Chili comes to comfort her daughter, who is now actually sobbing, and as Chili embraces her, in Bingo's head, she basks in the light of the sun. "I'm a big girl now," she says, looking back at the earth egg she broke free from. This is where you hear the middle section of the piece, the part marked Andante maestoso. It's the part that everyone seems to like.
Remember, I'll always be here for you, even if you can't see me, because I love you.
And if the Chili/God comparison wasn't clear, you then see Chili go around and pick up all the mess of everyone's restless meandering. She returns Fluffy to Bingo, this time with friends, who all help shelter Bingo in place until she's ready to try again, for real this time. It's hard learning to sleep alone, to grow up. The fear of losing that closeness, that godlike impression of a parent that comes from the intimacy and affection and constant attention of infancy. But all people must grow up. must leave the womb, the core. They must face the reality of Saturn. In other words, Saturn doesn't play because for now, it's too much for her to hear. In the original, each time the Maestoso theme ends, it leads the listener feeling a cadence that never properly resolves. It's either pointedly darted away from, or just sort of left hanging. But at the end of Sleepytime, it does resolve. Perfectly. In the aforementioned ABC article, Joff talks about the episode titled Bike. Bike, like many great Bluey episodes, is conceptually very simple, but that doesn't detract from how adorable it is. He explains the concept came from his experiences teaching piano. He says the single piece he most often used to teach was the famous Ode to Joy, the theme from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, because of how it fits perfectly under the 5 fingers on a piano. When Bike begins, we see Bluey in a park, learning to ride a bike and getting frustrated because she isn't automatically good at it. For the rest of the episode, Bluey and her dad just sit and watch what's going on with other kids around them. All of them are in the process of learning how to accomplish whatever task. As the episode unfolds, we hear Ode to Joy first broken up and then with more detail, until the end with a little faux opera with each kid completing their respective tasks in some way or another.
She's gonna do it! She's gonna do it!
In the ABC article, they also talk about some of the uses of Bach in the show. But one of my favorite uses of Bach comes from an episode that came out after this interview, in the current most season 3. In this article, Joff mentions how music like Bach's is so interpretable, and I think this is a good example. The joy of man's desiring is after all a melody most likely to be heard at a wedding or a funeral. Now, I can't say, like in the other 2 episodes I mentioned, that I know Joff or whoever else's broad intention here in using this tune, in that for all I know it could just be that the piece is by Bach, someone the show has used at least a few times before this, or that it's called The Joy of Man's Desiring, and the episode surrounds male characters. I don't have that information, but I do know how I feel about it, and I'm going to share my overanalysis either way. This episode is titled Space, and yeah, it's also outer space related. It surrounds 3 of the show's side characters, Jack, Rusty, and Mackenzie. They all play a game of outer space using an old wooden boat as their ship. It goes fine at first, until Jack, clearly a relative expert in outer space compared to his friends, mentions the concept of a black hole. He says it's a sun that got really small and made a hole, and that no one knows what happens when you go into it. It's a concept that, for whatever reason, just kind of breaks Mackenzie for a bit. At first he tries to make it part of the game, role-playing that their ship got pelleted by asteroids while he was fixing the busted boosters. That way he can spin off and just have a think by himself. He even rationalizes it, saying that the reason they didn't detect the asteroid was because Dudatron, Jack's character...
Maybe Dudatron is damaged too?
Maybe.
Jack's eyes dart around considering the idea. Mackenzie can't catch a break though. He knows he doesn't want to hurt the game, but when he breaks away from the group, they find him. So he spells it out, saying he wants to pretend they left him alone. They protest, arguing they need their lead scientist to put everyone in stasis. But as soon as they all lie down, Mackenzie instead goes out. He is the lead scientist after all, and he needs to find out what's in the black hole. It's my job to figure everything out, he tells them. The piece that plays throughout the episode is often called The Joy of Man's Desiring, but this name is in fact a modified version of the original English translation. Bach did not write the original tune either. It was a hymn by Johann Schopp before he used it in one of his cantatas. And since then it has spread out into thousands of different arrangements. Usually it's in 3/4, but this one isn't. It's also pretty slow, but I feel like I understand the idea behind it. At the beginning of the episode, you hear the theme gradually building, being constructed in small bits until about the middle part, where they're all laying in stasis. Similar to the episode Bike, I believe, or at least I feel, the intention here was to mimic the process of teaching piano, or maybe just the process of learning piano. Let me explain what I mean. In every version of The Joy of Man's Desiring, there tends to be a particular progression of intervals, and even following it as a single note line, it looks like this. Note, this hypothetical version I'm using is in C major, but the version in the episode is in B flat. Here we see the first 2 bars introduce the key of C, focusing on C, E, and G, the root, 3rd, and 5th scale degrees of C, which make up the C major triad. Therefore, these bars most strongly suggest the tonality of C. The next 2 bars change tonality, moving first to the 4th, or the subdominant, focusing on the root, 3rd, and 5th scale degrees of F, A, and C. Then they change again to the 5th, or the dominant, G, focusing on its root, 3rd, and 5th, G, B, and D. This time, though, there's also the intrigue of F, the minor 7th of G. 7ths in Bach's time were considered strictly dissonant and were only ever used in a transitory way, though they could absolutely add drama in crucial places nonetheless. Here, they help us return to the tonic for the next 4 bars, until the perfect cadence at the end. That's the movement from the 5th back to the tonic at the end of the phrase. Now, bear with me here as I set up a scene that plays in tandem with the events of the episode. And just give me a chance here, because I admit this is kinda conceptual. Imagine you're a kid just figuring out this melody for the first time. You might remove any left-hand parts and focus on the right. You might not be familiar with much music in 3/4, so you end up changing it to 4/4 as you practice. You might remove the more complicated elements of its modulation and focus on only moving from the tonic to the 5th and back again. You don't actually understand voice leading or tonality on an intimate level yet, but you do know there is something there. There is some process in the concession of notes that is deepening this melody, deepening this emotion that is being drawn from you. So you play it hesitantly, then more fully. You focus on what stands out to you, reflect on it. It's something bigger than you can quite understand. In the present episode, each time Mackenzie trails off to contemplate the black hole, we hear a series of chords that by my reading include the 1st and 4th ascending, and then the 7th and 5th descending.
The black hole.
This is a halo of the tonality of the piece. Perhaps it's the sound of these chords being played in a sequence, to better understand their relationships. The flashback, after Mackenzie steps into the black hole, is another one of those highly interpretable things in the show. Some people read it as coping with abuse or trauma. I don't think those ideas are wrong. If anything, I think maybe they could be a little limiting. After all, it isn't necessarily trauma that Mackenzie experiences in the flashback. It's really no more traumatic than what Bingo experiences in her dream. It's separation anxiety, you know? But then the human experience is traumatic. No one gets out of life without dealing with pain and trauma. And when Mackenzie emerges from the colorful yet disorienting slide in his flashback, he's alone. He doesn't see his mom in sight. He's noticeably just a tiny little puppy, and he fears his mother has left him behind. But she's just right over there. His present-day teacher Calypso assures him he just got mixed up in the slide. The next line, as a one-for-one reading of a memory, isn't really logically tenable.
Mackenzie, you know what's here now. You don't need to keep coming back to this place.
What does she mean by that? He doesn't have to keep going down the slide? It makes little sense read literally because this memory isn't really literal. The fear and trauma of this moment is emotional, based on the fears of a child who can hardly understand the world he's in, who is scared of the realization that he is in fact in a world of unknowns, of black holes and of music theory, of sleeping alone and growing old, of dying alone. We're all alone when we die. Your mother won't be there to hold your hand or pick you up and lead you into the next world. You'll have to be brave.
You have to be the bravest you've ever been. Okay, I'll be the bravest I've ever been.
Okay, so I know I've only talked about a couple episodes in any detail so far, but this is already going on longer than I was aiming for. So for the sake of time, I think it's important that before the video ends, we talk about the Bluey theme song. After all, bits of the theme end up in the score of many episodes, most commonly at the beginning of them, and there's been a lot of discussion about the intro online. So you might have heard that. The theme song of the Bluey intro uses a rhythm called the Bo Diddley beat. This beat is based on the 3/2 clave. A clave is a rhythmic pattern used as a tool for keeping time in Cuban music. However, many of these rhythms originally came from transnational musical exchanges, largely between different groups of African diaspora, that is to say, communities of people descended from Africa who live elsewhere, mainly the Americas. This particular clave has been used in a great deal of songs since and before Bo Diddley's use. For instance, in Ghana, Naplago rhythms sound very similar. And in a manuscript written in the 13th century by music scholar Safi al-Din al-Urmawi, he notates more or less this very rhythm, along with a great deal of theory related to music in general. He even presents it all very beautifully and intricately. There's a lot to be said about this manuscript, though maybe this isn't the place for it. But even if we're only talking about music in America, where I live, several scholars have noted the very prominent use of this clave in many forms of popular music. And some claves might date back through all of human history, essentially. Not to make clave seem primitive. What I'm saying is, these rhythms are the rhythms of humans, and they have a specific sonic significance. In fact, in many ways, it's better to think of clave as a kind of theoretical framework for understanding music, much like harmony. Since, like harmony, clave is based on human emotional responses to hearing ratios of the first prime numbers. The 3/2 clave in particular is notable for its creation of a kind of metrical ambiguity, with the 3 side implying triple meter and the 2 side confirming the 4/4 time without hitting the downbeat. But in spite of all that, in terms of the meter of the song, I know I'm avoiding the elephant in the room, and that's the controversy about the time signature. In this video by YouTuber Adam Neely, he goes over some of the prevailing theories about the time signature of the Bluey intro. Personally, it was always my impression that the basis of the scene was a kind of game. I didn't know it was called musical statues, though. I only learned that after a recent episode confirmed it. In musical statues, the players all dance around until someone pauses the music, with the last one to freeze losing the round. Looking at the animation, I thought the logic of the game was pretty clear, and as such, I imagined that diegetically, the song that the characters are listening and dancing to is in 4/4. However, I understand this is not the most convenient way to express this song through notation, nor is it the way that the actual composer said that he wrote it. According to Joff, the time signature is in 4/4, goes to 7/8 after the first break, then 5/4, and then back to 4/4 again. This way is immediately far more convenient, as for instance, all the names in the roll call now happen on the first of their preceding bars, instead of being all over the place. Now, regardless if we interpret the piece as changing in time signature or being totally in 4/4 with some added fermata of particular lengths, even though I'm not sure if that's a thing, I think this is a tongue-in-cheek kind of joke about... Actually, never mind. But regardless if we revert to the 4/4 diegetic music theory of the Bluey intro or use the actual answer, the length of these pauses has a specific significance. First, Chili loses the game, followed by a pause of 3 beats. We even see these beats play out in the swinging of Chili's hips after the song stops. Then the song goes on to Bandit with a pause of 2, Bingo with a pause of 1, and finally Bluey's bit plays out with no pause at all. If we look at the scene, we can see that the first two out, Mom and Dad, are both hardly even paying attention to the game. Instead, they both just close their eyes and lose themselves in the music, with a smile of false arrogance. Like many of the games and other interactions between the girls and Mom and Dad in the show, the parents are perfectly content to lose, though they try to make it look less than obvious from the perspective of their young children.
Hello? Huh? What? Well, that's twice now, and there's no one here. Certainly a very strange occurrence.
Bandit even gives a little eye roll to encourage the girls' competitiveness. After their parents lose the game, Bluey and Bingo's dances get noticeably more chaotic, with Bluey winning the game, getting the freeze frame, and also to have the show named after her, I guess. The characters in the intro are taking part in a competitive event, but it's one that's both contained and entrained by the closeness, patience, and mutual love of the characters. This structure of gaps becoming progressively shorter is only one of the methods this piece uses to communicate this concept of convergent love. It also does this through the use of instruments and melody. The song starts with the main theme on melodica, a choice that emphasizes the childlike nature of the show. In the second part, it strips it down and adds distortion to the guitar, which plays the aforementioned 3/2 clave in a way a number of rock songs do. In all versions of the Bluey intro I can find, the second segment expands vertically the notes in use. The only exception to the dyads in this part are chords that are all notably also incomplete. The third part that repeats the original melody adds a little depth to it, but it's the final portion where everything comes together, with the use of more instruments contributing to larger and wider chords. And finally, well, in a lot of piano tutorials, there's the eventual use of the E major triad to top everything off in a satisfying way. What I love about the music in the intro comes down to how it communicates its ideas to its audience. The discussion of the time signature was relevant largely because, as is, the song can be difficult to sync up with when singing, especially for young children. And I think the idea of a song that is diegetically more easy but has a hidden depth is a decent parallel to the show itself. Many children's shows teach lessons to their audience, but in Bluey, these lessons become critical. Fundamental. Small children gain and lose synapses in their brain constantly. They are plastic to every experience. They are their experiences. But Bluey is not only concerned with teaching kids, it's also about teaching parents, and for the benefit of everyone, so that all people have the skills and coping mechanisms and empathy necessary to become self-actualized adults. Bluey is often focused on teaching lessons to its audience, but these lessons don't resonate on some confined level. They deepen. This is a common theme throughout Bluey, and it traces through so many elements. In my opinion, it can be viewed as a kind of love, but not an unconditional love, or rather not only an unconditional love. This love is inexorable. Its inevitability is natural law, and as sure as you are, it is. So I hope you liked the friggin' Bluey video. There's a lot of time spent kind of working this one out, and it's different than what I've done so far, so, tell me what you like about it, and subscribe, and all that stuff.